Welcome to All About Impact, the official podcast of Imagine If Insights and Strategy. I'm your host, Susan Petoyan. All About Impact is the only podcast in the world that is exclusively dedicated to the art and science of creating real and positive impact with data, research, and insights. We push ambitious marketers, practitioners, and users of data, research, and insights to create meaningful, tangible, real-world impact with their work. Join us as we bring you diverse perspectives from hand-picked impact champions, incredible cross-disciplinary leaders who are masters at activating insights to transform business and achieve unparalleled success for their teams, organizations, careers, and of course, customers. Now is the time to venture into the world of influence and impact far beyond data and insights. Tune in today and boldly unleash the impact champion in you. In this episode of All About Impact, my guest is Rachel Pruitt, Director of Enterprise Insights at Target, where she leads the Operations and Capabilities team. As a truly human-obsessed leader, Rachel cares a lot about driving impact with research, which is even more challenging in larger organizations or at the enterprise level. Why more challenging, you ask? Well, have you ever wondered why large companies move so slow sometimes on seemingly clear market signals? Well, much like moving mountains, you need to have many factors in place. And if you did not guess the ability to bring in intangible shifts in thinking and behavior at the corporate level, you must tune in to today's episode. Hello. Welcome to All About Impact, Imagine If podcast. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have the amazing Rachel Pruitt with us. Rachel is the Director of Enterprise Insights at Target. She's a human-obsessed leader. Understanding humans and driving impact is really important for her. Rachel leads the Enterprise Insights and Operations and Capabilities team at Target, and her main mission is to ensure that their team has the best-in-class partners and capabilities, processes, and skills. Much harder to do than to read for me, right? That quick intro. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Me too. I know you and I've spoken about a couple of these things in the past, and we both care a lot about it. But why don't we start off with a little bit more background, Rachel? Please tell our audience about your brilliant career track, and your background in the insights space. Maybe hit on a couple of specifics to help our audience get to know you a little bit more.
So my journey to insights, I think, started when I was really young, actually. I grew up with deaf parents, and so I was always going back and forth between deaf culture and hearing culture, and just became very curious about people and why people do the different things they do in different cultures. And so then I go to college, I study finance and psychology. I've got this really analytical side of my brain, but I'm fascinated by people and just didn't really know how to merge those two things at the time. Mm-hmm. And so my first job out of college was in finance at General Mills. And my second role, I was working on Pillsbury innovation, and I was working with a cross-functional team that had insights as part of that. And that for me was just like the big unlock, a career where I got to analyze people and why they do what they do. And I just kind of fell in love. And so was fortunate enough to have been able to make that switch into insights, and then spent about 12 years doing a variety of different insights roles, everything from working on brands, campaigns, innovation, to working in our central organization. And then just about 10 months ago, made a switch over to Target and have been building operations and capabilities for that team.
Fantastic. What a journey. I love the beginning of your story, the fascination with human nature and people in general, and the departure from finance. That makes me extra excited, because I feel like maybe, some of our audience might disagree with me, but, psychology more exciting perhaps than finance, but that's a separate talk show or a show for another time. Rachel, I know that when we first connected, we both had very clear kind of, focus on this idea of impact, driving impact with research, strategic research in particular. One of the biggest challenges in our industry for client-side researchers and folks around those researchers, like stakeholders from different functions, is the constant pressure, right, to show impact, to drive impact with all initiatives, but specifically with research. And this is particularly hard, I think, when you have complex, non-traditional or non-routine, types of research projects. Let's call them like strategy projects. Before we dive into that, give us a little bit more perspective on this concept of impact. How do we define it? What do we think should be included when we think about impact? Based on your experience, Rachel, in these amazing brands, what methodologies or approaches have you seen that work well in your experience, or maybe not so well, in defining research impact, right? There's lots of different ways to define impact, but I know that you have probably a little bit broader definition than ROI, for example, right? So how do you think about impact? How do you define impact?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think it's one that the research industry wrestles with all the time. To me, impact means somebody made a decision based on the research that I did. It informed the direction of our strategy. You can see it coming in our advertising campaigns, the innovation that we're launching. And so fundamentally, to me, it comes down to, did someone do something with the research that you provided?
Wonderful. The term actionability, it's been bastardized. Can I say that? It's been used so much in the industry, and we throw it away, kind of nonchalantly all the time. But it is really kind of going back to that core idea of, I gave you insight, you or team will make a decision that hopefully leads to an action. And it's fascinating because more often than not, or maybe some of our audience might disagree with this, actually, action does not take place. People do not take action. Tell me maybe a couple of scenarios where you have seen that frustration, where good research has taken place, results have been shared, socialized, but nothing comes out of it, kind of the opposite of taking action. What have you seen that has been particularly frustrating?
Yeah, I mean, you see it happen, and it is really frustrating, right? Because you've been so immersed in this, you've been invested in it, you've spent all this time with it. But I think that's one of the key things to remember, is that the people that are going to be taking action or making the final decision have not been as close to it as we are. And so I think it's really important on the front end to get those people involved and really understand, what are their needs? Is it actually what they're asking for, or is it actually something else? And we really have to probe, I think, to understand that. How are they incented? What motivates them? Really thinking about that, and then helping them see themselves in some way in the research. I had an opportunity to listen to a professor from Darden years ago, and she talked about this idea of a self-selected stakeholder. And the whole idea behind that is, once someone has invested something, it could be money, it could be time, whatever it is, they are now invested in that thing.
Yeah.
And so leverage that, bring them along the journey. And then at the end of the research, I think it's our job to translate what the research means and what someone should do about it. We shouldn't just leave that to our business partners. And I think sometimes that's why it gets lost.
I love that, because first of all, that idea of that psychological investment, right? Even though it's a little bit more work up front, it actually does end up making it easier for the organization or that particular team to actually embrace the findings, even if they're not what they were expecting or what they were hypothesizing. Unfortunately, I don't know if you've seen this, Rachel, but often that conversation up front doesn't occur, or research is, especially complicated research, is a little bit of a, I don't want to say a black box, but the team goes away, does their magic, spend some time, and then the end user team is kind of out of the loop. And then they're asked to take this action that they didn't go through the journey to arrive at that conclusion. So I think that's a great insight for our team, take people who are going to use the data or the insights through the process as much as it makes sense, right? They don't need to look at every single piece. Now, the the idea of impact as part of kind of the cultural language or the fabric of a research team, it feels like, often it is, when we think about good research or impactful research, the first thing that comes to mind is often like, is it the right method? Is it accurate? Is it the right methodology, right? Is it on time, on budget, all of those things? Why is it that impact is not something that we think a lot about upfront? What are the drivers, or what have you seen as the reasons for thinking about impact at the very end after the results come out? Why is it so hard to conceptualize impact in the first place on the brand side, on the corporate side, where things are, there's a million variables, 1,000 teams, and lots of work and lots of different kind of moving pieces? Impact is hard to conceptualize. Why?
It really is. And I think part of that is what you just said, right? It's one input of many. And so I think it's hard to kind of tease that apart and understand the impact of just that thing on its own. I also think, to your point on how do we start thinking about it at the beginning and not just at the end, not getting so focused on what are the questions that I need to answer, but really thinking about how is this thing going to get used? What is it going to inform? And then how do I set up my research in a way that helps us measure that to some degree?
Absolutely. I almost feel like it should be, I don't want to say checklist, but it should be one of those, how I think about what's the sample size or what's the methodology. It should be kind of like a check, an item to have dedicated time and space to hold that time and space for combined, like a joint conversation with stakeholders. By the way, do you think that should be research-led, or do you think that should be like marketing or whoever the stakeholders are? Who should be asking these questions in the first place about what are we going to do with all this stuff?
I think it's on us as researchers to do that. I think we shouldn't start executing research until we understand, why is this being asked for? Right. What are they going to do with it? What are we trying to do? Is this really even the right questions? I fundamentally believe that's on us as researchers.
It is scary though, right, Rachel, if it's a team that may not be fully empowered, or if there's like change in the organization, to ask, not a hard question, but a bit of a, challenging question about, well, what are you going to do with this? I feel like there's a lot more than just, okay, we need to do this as part of the process. I think the psychology of asking the right questions about impact and what's going to come out, and how is the organization going to behave around this piece of insight, is a lot more complicated than a checklist.
100%. And I think, it can be a scary thing to be asking those questions. I think ultimately, if we go back to, we are probably all trying to do the same thing, right? We're trying to grow the business. We're trying to do what's right for our consumer, et cetera. And so I think as long as we can ground those questions in, I want to make sure I understand this so that I'm setting up the research in the right way, or I want to make sure I understand this so that, we can get to this growth that, is our goal that we're setting out for. So I think always coming back to that, like, we have common goals in mind, and I'm asking questions in service of those.
I love that. It's less about, confronting or challenging assumptions or expectations, and more about help you get the best out of this that you want, right? Yeah. Awesome.
Exactly.
And I think, leadership is key here. Even if, let's say, there are some teams where it's not a very big research group, right, Rachel? And you have maybe someone who's a more junior or like mid-level professional who has to provide the insights, and they still need to have the courage to have these conversations, to build these relationships as a platform where you can have these conversations for every single study that the team does. If this is particularly interesting for me coming from you, Rachel, because with your kind of finance lens or finance background, right? We often, when it's time to do budgeting, or at the end, when it's time to look at performance, et cetera, we often think about, okay, we spent $50,000 and we got this, and that resulted in this kind of, let's say, revenue lift or whatever the case might be. It's very hard to do those types of math exercises, but usually that's kind of, the go-to way to define impact or, introduction of a new innovation or whatever, right? Can we think about impact a little bit more broadly, perhaps a little bit more holistically? I know personally, I know that you agree with this, but how else can we think about impact? Like beyond the numbers, beyond the product release, beyond the sales data, etc. What are some other dimensions, maybe, Rachel, that you think would be important to include when we're trying to shape, first of all, define, but also achieve impact?
Well, and it's kind of funny as a former finance person saying this, but I actually don't think we should try to quantify the impact of our research with an ROI metric, because I think, one, that's really hard to do. It's not going to be that accurate anyways.
Right.
I've seen teams try to do that in the past, and we spend so much time and energy trying to figure out how to calculate that when we should just be doing really great work.
Right.
So I love the idea of how you think about impact more broadly. And I think it's everything from, are people making decisions based on that information? Are you seeing it show up in strategies? Are you hearing leaders of your company replaying what they've heard from you? I think those are all ways to have impact beyond calculating a number.
I love that. It's basically, it goes back to this notion of, are you maybe improving or changing in some detectable way the way people think, people around within the company leadership ranks, they might think about the business issue or the target market, whatever the case might be, or the product, or perhaps the way they behave. And that's not tangible. That's not something we line item somewhere, right?
Right.
How can we make that part of our standards of like judging if our work is impactful? Like, should we look for those things? Should we take notes? If I'm a director of research, in a brand somewhere, how can I look for those things?
I think there's part of it that will happen naturally. Like, you will sit in meetings and you will hear the conversation changing, or you will see people approaching things in a new way. And then there's another part of it where I think we need to be very intentional about following up what was done with this research.
Right.
And ideally, we're not just handing it over and then letting them go and decide what to do with it. Hopefully, we're partners along that process. Right. And so I think the more that we can get ourselves embedded and showing people that we want to be partners, not just researchers,
right,
the more we'll be able to do that.
I love that. Kind of like the holy grail, if you will, of how we interact with the rest of the organization in a complex, changing, fluid, often situation. And that partnership has to be there, as opposed to, hey, I present, and the next day you go back to or the next hour you go back to your desk, and hopefully you figure out kind of what the action items are.
Right.
Recipe for lots of research to be, in the old days we used to say to be stored in a binder on your desk, but now it's like Pointer or Google Drive, wherever it is, to be stored there and never touched, right? Right.
Exactly.
Let's talk about one particular kind of situation where that might be extra hard to do, Rachel. When, let's say, you've brought your internal folks, your stakeholders along, they've bought in, they're kind of vested, depending on the research, but whatever it is that they were hoping for does not pan out. In fact, the insight or the story from the consumer, from the market, is the complete opposite to what that leadership team wanted. Right. In this case, it's particularly harder to not only convince them like this is the truth, but also to convince them to do something that they don't want to do. Let's say take a different action or not take action, etc. In your experience, what I'm describing, does that still happen a lot? Or do you feel like by the time the results come out, basically, even the expectations of what the findings are kind of at a place where people are open and they'll embrace it regardless of what it is?
Yeah, I do think that happens. And I think, a lot of times as researchers and insights professionals, we do have to deliver tough messages or messages that are different than what people are expecting. And I think, in my experience, the approaches that have worked best in doing that are, again, going back to, we have the same ultimate goal in mind. And while this isn't what we wanted to hear, it does give us clarity on what we need to do.
Right.
And then I do think it's helpful if, I think sometimes people can see things as like it's completely this thing or it's completely this thing. And now it's completely this thing. And so all of this, we just wasted all of our time.
Right.
And so I think the more that we can help people see that it doesn't have to be so black and white, and that we can leverage learnings or we can leverage things from our past hypotheses to inform the way forward,
right,
that can be really powerful.
Right. I love that. So even if it's not what the teams expected, let's say, there's still a lot of learnings and insight that can apply even in that in-between gray area, right, that the research team should bring out. So a lot of these questions kind of dance around this issue of who is that researcher, right, that can really is well positioned to drive impact beyond just kind of the stated criteria, but more about changing hearts and minds of different parts of the organization. Can we talk a little bit, Rachel, about the types of skills that might be needed, or the types of, I don't want to say talent, but what is needed for a research team to behave like this, to act the way that is required to drive this impact?
I love this question so much. I honestly think it's basically using the skills that we already have as researchers and applying them to our business partners. And so I think it's really important to build empathy for our business partners, develop relationships, understand their needs, understand what motivates them, then figure out how can you use research to help them. Can you answer a question? Do they need ideas on opportunities going forward? Are you proactively bringing forward something that they might not already know that they need? And then on the back end, it's really helping them understand, here's why this is important for you based on what I know and what we've talked about. Here's how this can help you inform the direction forward. So I honestly think it's a lot of the skills that we use as researchers. It's asking really good questions. It's listening, building empathy. I think those are probably three of the primary ones.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like the way we interact or the way we approach consumers or customers, whatever the case might be, right? That approach, that kind of orientation towards learning, understanding, being helpful can be applied here internally. Rachel, so one of the key things that we should hit on, I think, is not all research is equal, right? Sometimes you have very quick, I don't want to say quick, but very, validation research, for example. It's either this or that. Yep. We've made a decision. Like, there's not a lot of discussion or a lot of kind of nuance about it. But on the other side, you have, this is my words for it, like, it's probably not very descriptive, but what I call strategy research. Like things like segmentation or a brand repositioning piece of work, whatever the case may be, right? Something that touches a whole lot of people and not just one team in marketing or in product, wherever the case might be. In my observation experience, these are harder when it comes to talking about impact because they're so big and their scale is so and they're like squishy and, you don't really have a clear vision of where you're going to go yet. We're kind of trying to figure out and create it together. Even though it's difficult, do you feel like it's more important to have these impact conversations up front for these strategic types of initiatives? Or how should we think about impact when it comes to like bigger, gnarlier pieces of work?
Yeah, I do think it's even more important in instances like that to understand from the beginning, how could this be used? What is this going to inform?
Right.
So that we can think about that when we do the research.
Yeah.
And then I think on the back end, it's, to your point, these are like such big things. They're hard to digest all at once. We as researchers want to share everything that we learned. Here's each of our segments and everything you need to know about every single segment. And the reality is like nobody can digest all that information. Yep. They won't remember it. And then, what was the point? And so I think as much as we can break those large foundational pieces of research into smaller components and then just focus on here's what you need to know given this question or this thing we're trying to achieve, it makes it much more digestible. And then that's where you can start seeing like the return on your investment. How many times are you able to use that with what different teams in what different areas?
I love that. So still applying some of the rules some of the kind of insights that we just covered earlier, like have the early conversations proactively upfront, involve people along the way, the right people, involve them as much as they're open to, etc. Choose the right methodology. Those are like the technical aspects. But for these larger projects, think a lot more about how you're actually deploying the insights and how you're truly kind of socializing them in a way that's easy to digest and memorable and sticks, right? Whatever is relevant, right? What would be the biggest barrier to impact if I don't do all those things that I just mentioned, right, Rachel, based on kind of your advice here? What would be kind of a biggest barrier, even if I do those still on these large projects, for things not happening, for behavior organizationally not changing, or actions, decisions not taking place? Any other big drivers or barriers that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think there are just business realities. So, having an understanding of the financial situation is always a good thing.
Great.
And then sometimes I think organizations can become very rooted in a certain way of doing things or in certain beliefs. That's hard to overcome. And I don't have a magic answer for that. I wish I did. But I think it's one of those things where it's like, then you have to start planting seeds. You have to understand, okay, is that person really influenced by data, or what is it that's going to, potentially help them open their mind and do a different perspective?
Yeah.
But it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. It is work. It's a ton of work above and beyond like writing or analyzing or the technical executional aspects of research. But it is possible with patience and intention. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think what you were hitting on there, super important, Rachel. Thank you for bringing it up. Being truly integrated into the business, right? Not being some island out there. I mean, hopefully this is not happening as much anymore, but where you're taking orders, but really understanding the key drivers of the business, the financial model, maybe like the partners internally, externally along the way, right? Any project that's going to touch them, you want to think about those as you're trying to engineer that impact with the work that that the team is doing. Awesome. Do you feel like as an industry as a whole, do we need to prioritize this discussion about impact a little bit more? This is a leading question, obviously, Rachel, but I feel like we don't talk a lot about this. We talk about technologies and methodology and all the kind of the technical executional aspect of our work, which is important, absolutely important. But what I call in retail, we used to call the last 100 feet, right, before the product is on the shelf. But what happens afterwards? I feel like as an industry, research, data, insights, etc., we don't even have the right words, the right language to talk about this, let alone prioritize it at the right level compared to other things that we need to, other messages we need to have, other than, it's actionable. Tell me about whether you share this perspective, what else you can add, what would be kind of your challenge or your, to the industry, your mission within our industry to change that conversation and give it the attention maybe it deserves.
I think as an industry, if we aren't talking about the impact or focused on the impact, what is the point? Like, why are we even doing research? And so I think it's something that we have to prioritize. We have to be intentional about. But I think if we don't focus on that and we just are doing really, really, really great, solid research, but there's no impact or action that's come from that, our industry will go away. I mean, it won't be needed.
I want to repeat that, underline that, stress that. Right now, it feels like that conversation is left for somebody else to have, right? It could be marketing, it could be digital, it could be finance, whoever, right? And if we don't even have our voice heard on that part of the journey or the life cycle of research, I feel like we're doing disservice to the consumer, right? It's not just understanding what consumers want. It's actually being able to truly like set up the companies that could truly deliver what the consumer want. So to me, absolutely agree. Like the industry is at risk, the consumer is at risk, and long term, the brand can lose because they do all this data gathering and gosh, like data is so cheap and so available, but nobody's really kind of figuring out, okay, what are we going to do and how do we make sure that the thing that we need to do is done?
It's such a good point. It's such a good point, Susan. On like at the end of the day, right? Our job is to represent the voice of the consumer within an organization.
Yeah.
And we are doing disservice to the people we're supposed to serve if we're not able to drive that impact.
Absolutely. Great. I love that. I love the kind of, I feel like there's a little bit of a mission here to bring to the forefront and ask these questions of our broader industry colleagues, make sure that everyone is taking time to think about these things with their clients, within their internal clients, stakeholders, etc. What is the most critical recommendation, Rachel, that you would have for insights folks, both on internal, on the brand side or corporate, as well as on the provider or agency side in this direction to make the impact conversation, the process of generating, guaranteeing impact, let's say, to make this a priority? What do you want people to do?
I would tell people, one, don't start the research until you understand why it's needed, how it's going to be used. Two, once you've done the research, make sure that people understand why what you're sharing with them matters to them. They might not understand why a certain metric is important or why this thing a consumer said is important. Yeah. We have to translate that. Yeah. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, I think, is just repetition and keep it simple, because our partners are bombarded with so much information on a daily basis. We have to get to the point. We have to get to the point quickly. And we probably have to repeat that over and over again. I've talked to colleagues, and I myself have been in this position where you share something and then someone comes back and asks a question that you've already answered. And you're like, I already answered that, Yeah. But that's reality. That's humans today, right? We have so much information coming at us that we have to simplify. We have to say it over and over again. And that's part of our jobs, I think.
Absolutely. I love the key word there was human for me, Rachel, because at the speed that everything is going at these days, right, with tremendous technology advancements like AI, for example, I feel like going back to that human, like taking the time to involve folks, ask the right questions, have the empathy, repeat, tell the story different ways, kind of lead them a little bit in the direction of whatever the truth is, whatever the insights are, etc. This is human stuff. This is not machine. There's no app for it. There's no technology for it, right?
Yep.
I feel like the only team that can truly do that is research and research adjacent. Maybe marketing can do that to some extent, etc. And that's powerful, and we should not let that go away. We should, I feel like, kind of really stand up and take that role, that leadership challenge.
Yeah. And I think there's so much conversation going on right now about, AI and is it going to, take jobs away and is it going to replace us? And I honestly think, how do we leverage that to be more efficient in certain ways, enable us to scale things? But that human element that you're talking about, Susan, I don't think will ever go away. And so that just unlocks more time and capacity for us to focus on that side of things and leverage technology on the other stuff.
Tools, whatever we have. Absolutely. So should we then conclude, Rachel, with this idea that actually thinking about impact, it's a matter of thinking about humans, working with humans around the data in an organization, right?
I love that so much, Susan. And it's human in so many ways, right? Yeah. It's human with the consumer. It's human with our business partners. I love that.
Yeah. Awesome. I think we can talk on and on about this, Rachel, but we usually end our conversation with 3 questions. And if it's okay, I wanted to ask you my questions. So we talk so much about impact and doing impactful work, making a difference with the research, with our interactions with our internal teams, etc. But what is one small thing maybe that you can share with us, Rachel, that you do in your daily life that creates positive impact for your community, for the people in your life around you, or the world broadly? It's a very open question.
I would say the thing that I try to do every single day, because it's very important to me, is make people feel seen and heard. And that can be anyone from consumers to my colleagues to my husband, my friends, my family. I just think that's really important, that people feel seen and heard. And it kind of goes back to that human element that you were talking about earlier.
This is goosebump level good, I have to say. Very good. Thank you for that really powerful answer there. The second question I have, Rachel, I have to look this up actually, is, okay, what do you recommend, encourage our audience, our listeners to do, one thing that they can do to have to drive, positive impact in their own lives or in the world, around them?
Build empathy. Ask questions.
Wonderful.
Listen more, like truly listen. And I think when you do that, impact will come.
This is like one-to-one, one-to-many, and it can spread. And the whole world will be a better place, right, with this. Awesome. Very good. I love how our conversation started with, research and all the way to like human connection and empathy and changing the world by listening. This has been so satisfying for me, at least. I know our listeners
likewise
will agree with this too, Rachel. If our audience, people in our audience wanted to get in touch, to learn more from you, to reach out to you, what would be kind of the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, Rachel Harris Pruitt. I would love to hear from anyone. Connect with me there.
Awesome. Very good. And I know you're pretty active on LinkedIn. You have some good opinions that you share. So I think it would be a delight for our folks, our audience, to find you there and continue to learn from your perspective. Rachel, I want to say thank you for being so generous with your insight, so real and human at the same time. I think it's refreshing. I still can't believe you have a finance background, but that's a separate conversation.
Hopefully no one in finance is listening and taking offense.
I love finance. No, they're our friends. They have to do what their job is, right? Speaking of empathy.
Right.
This has been absolutely delightful. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime in the future as together with others, we start to change the conversation around impact within our industry.
Well, and thank you for your passion about this very important topic. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Awesome. It's our pleasure to amplify that and share that with the world, Rachel. Thank you. As you heard in this episode of All About Impact, it takes many, many strategies to drive real impact in larger organizations with research and insight. How are you approaching your impact creation within large brands? Are you even thinking about impact up front or at all? Impact is the next dimension of research and insight, and it is possible with the right partner. Reach out to me, Susan Petoyan, on LinkedIn, and let's together discover the impact champion in you. Tune in next week for another episode of All About Impact.